In our previous video, we found that economic growth, sustained long-term economic growth, can come from increasing natural resources, real capital, so machines, automation, an increase in technology, or an increase in the quantity and quality of labor. And when it comes to Canada, our primary source of economic growth is from labor. So what we're going to do in this video is we're going to look at how we measure the amount of labor. So we're going to look at the working age population, the labor participation rate, and we're going to look at the unemployment rate. I'm just going to fast forward our slides here that we've gone through in previous videos. And so we want to understand some key terms. The first one we want to understand is the idea of working age population. So you are working age population if you are over 15 or 15 or over, and you are not in the armed forces, and you are not a resident of an Aboriginal reserve or territory. All right, so let's break this down. So working age population, 15 or older, okay? So of the age that you can legally work, and then not being in the armed forces. The reason that we have our working age population and therefore our unemployment rate and employment rate based on people not in the armed forces is we want to be able to compare what's happening in the labor market in one country versus another. And some countries have conscription, they have mandatory service, and so it's really hard to tell what's happening in their labor market if everyone is automatically employed because everyone serves a time in the armed forces. So we exclude those who are in the armed forces. Okay, so we're looking at really voluntary employment. And then we exclude those who live on Aboriginal reserves or territories. And that's because in Canada, when it comes to statistics about the country, in most cases we exclude data for the Aboriginal reserves and territories because they're treated as if they're their own mini country within Canada. So they keep their own unemployment and labor force participation rates separate from Stats Canada. And you can actually find that data online if you just Google it. So we know who's a working age population. So they're 15 or older, they're not in the armed forces, they're not living on an Aboriginal reserve or territory. So then we take that working age population and we look at who's in the labor force. So you are in the labor force if you are working part-time, full-time, or you are looking for work. Okay, so I'm just going to go to the next slide here. So for example, if we have a population that's 37.59 million, the working age is 30.8 million. Okay, so who are those extra people? Those extra people are those who are under 15, okay, are in the armed forces. Okay, so then of the working age population, we then have our labor force, and our labor force is about 20.27 million. So these are the people who work full-time, part-time, or are looking for work. So let's just grab a pen here. So who are these people? These are people who are not looking for work and not working. So this might be people who are independently wealthy, so they don't have to work. They might be retired. They might be full-time students. So you're not working right now, you're going to school. That would be you. You're working age population, but you're not working or looking for work. Now, of the labor force, we can look at those who are employed, have a job. That's 19 million. And then we can look at this other group here, which are the unemployed. Now, before we get to calculating the unemployment rate, let's first look at what is called the labor force participation rate. That is when we look at what percentage are in the labor force of those who are working age. And we need to take that one step further back and say, okay, well, what does it really mean to be in the labor force? We said part-time, full-time, and looking for work, but it's actually a little bit more complicated of a definition. So let's just look here. All right, so you are in the labor force if you are gainfully employed. So full-time or part-time, you have a job, you're considered to be in the labor force. Now, if you're not currently working because you're on a medical leave, you're on vacation, you're on strike, you are still considered to be part of the labor force and you're still considered to be employed. If you've been laid off within the last 26 weeks, but you're expected to be recalled back, you are still part of the labor force as well. And this is particularly relevant in Alberta because what we do in oil production, particularly up in Fort McMurray, is that there are periods of shutdowns. And during shutdowns, a lot of the labor is temporarily laid off and then hired back a couple months later after the big oil companies have done maintenance, cleaning, etc. So you're still part of the labor force if you've been laid off, but you expect to be recalled back. Now, you're part of the labor force if you are starting a job in the next 30 days. You signed your contract, but you haven't started work yet. Just be part of the labor force and employed. Different than in the US, because what if you're our program and you've lined up a job, but you've lined up a job that's not going to start for a couple months, more than 30 days. Well, if you have already lined up that job for after the contract, then you are considered part of the labor force employed. So there are differences in the labor force definitions. The other difference in definition has to do with what it for work. So in the US, you must be seeking employment to be considered to be unemployed. So yeah. Now, what is the definition of looking is slightly different between. Is that just I read the ads, I went to Indeed.com, actually submitting my resume and going to interview. US, the actively seeking is a bit, you must be applying for jobs and going to interviews. In Canada, it's a bit more passive. If you're simply looking, posted, then you're considered to be in the labor employed. Because of this difference we see here, Canada's unemployment. So the difference in definition makes Canada's makes Canada's unemployment rate 1% higher than the US. So if we were to compare the unemployment rate to the unemployment rate in the US, we have to recognize the difference in the definition. So let's go for employment rates for Canada and the US. All right. We're going to Stats Canada. The unemployment for Canada is 5.7%. Fred, and we find the unemployment in the US is 3.5. So let's slides. Come on, slides. All right, so Canada was, and the US, of course, that number was 3.5. There's a difference between Canada and the US, 5.7 to 3.5. But if we take into consideration the difference in our definitions of labor force, we actually need to make an adjustment to compare. So you either need to subtract 1% from Canada or add 1% to the US in order to compare between. So for example, if we make the adjustment, Canada's unemployment rate is really about 4.7% if you're using the US definition of labor. And so then you can see it's not as big of a difference between the two countries. Now, there's still a difference, right? Canada's struggling a bit more with their economy than the US has been, and so you can see that when we compare the unemployment rate. But you're going to have to make an adjustment, make Canadian unemployment 1% lower to go for that difference in definition. All right, so we've talked about what it means to be in the labor force. Now we want to do is calculate what is called the labor force participation rate. So the labor force participation rate is a percentage of working age population. So of the people who can work, how many of them are working or trying to work? So let's go to our data. As of September 2019, The working age population was 30.8 million, and the labor force was 20.27 million. So to find our labor force participation rate, we need to take our labor force, our 20,271,600, divide by our working age population, so 30,803,800, and we're going to multiply the whole thing times 100. All right, so let's put that information into our calculator. So 22,71600 divided by 30,803,800 times 100, and we do that, we get 65.8% is our labor force participation rate. All right, so let's go back to Stats Canada. And if we actually click in here where it says unemployment rate, and we scroll down to the bottom where we have our data, we can find labor force characteristics first by age and gender. Then you can see it by type of industry, and then you can see third is province. So if you're looking for the unemployment rate and labor force participation rate of Alberta, you can click in Table 3. Let's take a look though at Table 1. And we're going to look at everyone who's 15 years and over. And you can see for August, it says population 30 million, 30.8 million. This is working age population. You see here labor force, which is the 20.27 million. And then you can see that the labor force participation rate is 65.8%, which is the same as what we just found. If you are looking for the labor force participation rate for the US, you could find that from Fred. So where we went and got the unemployment rate for the US, if you just type into the search box labor force, it'll bring up the labor force participation rate. All right, so of the working age population, of the people who can work, we have 65.8% who want to work. Now, of those who want to work, of the labor force, how many are unemployed? So we want to find the unemployment rate. So the unemployment rate is the number of unemployed divided by the labor force times 100. All right, well, the challenge with the information we have here is that it doesn't show the number who are unemployed, but we can find the number who are unemployed. So the number unemployed is going to be our labor force minus those who have a job. So we can take our 20,271,600, subtract the 19 million who are working full-time, part-time, and if we type that into our calculator, 22,71600 minus 19,111,500. Make sure I have all the numbers correctly. All right, if we do that, we end up with 1,160,100 people who are looking for work but can't find it. So now we need to calculate an unemployment rate. To find the unemployment rate, we need to take that 1,160,100 and divide it by the labor force, the 20,271,600, and of course multiply times 100. So let's put that into our calculator. 1,160,100 divided by 20,271,600 times 100, and we get an unemployment rate of 5.7%. So in fact, we can go back to Stats Canada and see those numbers. And you can see here the unemployment rate at 5.7%. So that's where that calculation came from. They're taking the number who are unemployed, the 1.16 million, and dividing it by the labor force, the 20.271 million. So you can see Stats Canada gives you both the number of employed and the number who are unemployed. So we can then calculate the labor force participation rate and the unemployment rate, or we can go to Stats Canada and those calculations are already done for you. As we said before, if you go and use Table 3, you can find it by province. And if you want to do information for the US, you can find it here on FRED, both the unemployment rate and the labor force participation rate.